Good day. Today is Wednesday, 30th July 2025, and as we come to the end of July, Prime Minister Keir Starmer of Britain has announced an ultimatum which he is delivering against Israel. He says that Israel must end its conflict in Gaza, it must agree to a ceasefire there, and must commit to a long-term peace settlement of its conflict with the Palestinians and in the Middle East. And this must all happen supposedly by September. And if it doesn't happen, well, Prime Minister Starmer is going to recognise the Palestinian state. He's going to follow, in other words, in the footsteps of his friend, President Emmanuel Macron of France. Now, I have a few things to say about this. The first is that this is, to anybody who's followed Keir Starmer's trajectory as a political leader, first as leader of the Labour opposition to the previous Conservative government, and even more as Prime Minister. Anyway, to anybody who's followed Keir Starmer's record closely, that person would have absolutely no doubt that he has been, shall we say, extremely reluctant or unwilling to make an announcement like this. He has shown throughout the last year a close adhesion to the policy of the previous Conservative government, which basically said little and did less about the situation in Gaza and in the Middle East generally, except, of course, that it was extremely hostile to Iran. Prime Minister Starmer has been the same, and as anybody who lives in Britain knows, especially anybody who's involved in discussing topics on the media, as I am, anybody knows, people who have deviated from the orthodoxy of British policy in the Middle East, who've spoken out against some of the things that have been happening in the Middle East, well, they face all sorts of pressures and potential penalties. And various laws, in particular one specific law, which has passed the House of Commons recently and has just been enacted into law, well, that takes that process further still. So Keir Starmer is not someone who would happily or willingly make a statement of this kind. He has done so under intense political pressure. Opinion polls show that the British public is generally shocked by the developments in Gaza, by what is taking place there. They become increasingly angry and disillusioned with the policies of Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. And this shock and dismay on the part of the wider British public is held even more strongly by the left and left of centre electorate that supports the Labour Party. In fact, during the election last year, it was notable that certain seats, constituencies, which the Labour Party lost during that election to challenges and which had previously either been Labour or had been expected to be captured by the Labour Party. Anyway, in these seats, critics of Keir Starmer's policy with respect to the situation in the Middle East and Gaza in particular tended to win against Labour candidates, resulting in 5 independent MPs of that sort sitting in the House of Commons now. So anyway, Starmer's had to respond to that, and he's had to respond to the growing unease and worry on the part of his own parliamentary party. I think it was about 3 weeks ago, they rebelled against his attempts to impose cuts in social security spending in Britain, and the rumblings within the Labour Parliamentary Party have also been there on the Gaza and Middle East issue, and Keir Starmer has retreated before them again. Now, to repeat once more, he's not doing this out of any sense of conviction, and in most cases, I suspect, though not in all cases, I suspect that that is not true of these Labour parliamentarians either. Rather, they are aware of the growing anger and unease on the part of the voters who voted them into the House of Commons, into Parliament, and they're very, very nervous that unless they start to bend to accommodate these voters, then they will lose their seats in the next election when it comes. So this announcement, to say it first, is basically yet another sign that Keir Starmer, that his authority in Britain, his authority over the government, his authority over the Labour Party, that his authority is weakening. In fact, I've already seen pieces which say that Starmer is in office but no longer in power, that he continues to hold the office of Prime Minister, but that he is not able to exercise power, the power of that office, effectively, and is obliged to retreat whenever he runs into significant opposition. Well, Keir Starmer's problems are in some respects the least of it. The other thing I have to say is that making a decision like this, to me, makes no sense at all. If Keir Starmer or the British government believe that a Palestinian state should be recognised, then they should recognise it. What is the point in waiting a few weeks before that happens? I mean, I don't see the logic of this at all. If the Israelis, for example, were to stop their operation in Gaza, if they were to agree to a ceasefire, even a temporary ceasefire, would that mean that a decision to recognise a state would be reversed and that state should not be recognised? If you believe, as Keir Starmer presumably does, that Palestine should be recognised as a state, then you proceed to do it. You don't give a warning to an entirely different state, Israel in this case, that you will recognise that state if they don't do certain things that you want. Anyway, as to this warning to the Israelis, obviously they are not going to heed it. There is no reason to think that the government of Israel, Prime Minister of Netanyahu, are going to pay any attention to this decision, this statement of Keir Starmer's at all. After all, what does it actually change? What real difference is it going to make in terms of the situation on the ground? The relationship between Israel and Britain will presumably continue as before. There's no sign that Keir Starmer, Prime Minister Starmer, or the British government are going to relax upon any of the measures that I've just discussed. Certainly, they show no sign or interest or intention of reversing that law which they have just passed, and which, by the way, I feel extremely nervous about discussing. That's the kind of law it is. So what actual difference is this going to make? It's another act of tokenism, it seems to me, in the face of events in Gaza, which cry out for decisive diplomatic action. Now, again, I am constrained in what I can say, but decisive diplomatic action in this case is not only what the situation calls for, it is also what can be done. I can think of all sorts of things that the British government could do which would have a far more important and pressing impact on the situation in Gaza than this one. Anyway, that's what I think about this. A prime minister, as I said, no longer fully in control. A prime minister who still comes up with what I consider to be illogical and even incomprehensible decisions, which portray weakness and hesitation and nothing else. And, well, statements from Britain, which again show the complacency and weakness of the British political class, of which, of course, Keir Starmer is a member, in the face of unfolding tragedies, which they don't seem, to be honest, to be especially concerned about. Anyway, that is all I'm going to say about this today. I'm going to return to the subject of the Middle East later in this program. There is another world leader who's taken perhaps, just possibly, some stronger diplomatic action, though that requires, as we shall see, an element of interpretation. But that's what I'm going to say about the policies of my own government, the British government, and what it is doing, and the announcement that the Prime Minister made yesterday. Now, speaking about British policy, we had a very interesting commentary or report yesterday from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, Russia's main agency for gathering political intelligence, if you like, Russia's equivalent to the CIA. Anyway, the SVR claims that in an alpine resort or resorts somewhere presumably in the Alps, I assume it was Switzerland, but I'm not sure that the country was identified, the British and American governments, or at least their representatives, met with the representatives of 3 Ukrainian officials. It may be even that these officials actually attended this meeting, though again I'm very unclear as to when this meeting is supposed to have taken place. Anyway, the officials in question were Kirill Budanov, the head of Ukrainian military intelligence, Andrei Yermak, the chief of staff of President Zelensky himself, and Valery Zelensky, the Ukrainian ambassador to Britain. And allegedly, this is all according to the Russian Foreign Intelligence Agency, the SVR, well, allegedly, these people who had this meeting in this alpine resort, was British, the Americans, Yermak, Zelensky, and Budanov, presumably through their representatives. Anyway, these people all supposedly agreed with each other that Zelensky must go, and that the person who must replace him must be none other than General Zulusni, the former military commander of the Ukrainian armed forces, who is now currently Ukraine's ambassador to London. Now, I am going to say straight away that I have massive problems with this story. The first, of course, is the source. We are dealing with a report from Russian intelligence. And the Russians may, almost certainly do, have very good intelligence by now in Ukraine. They probably run a very sophisticated intelligence operation in Ukraine. I'm going to make a guess that they're able to listen to many of the messages, and I suspect that by now they've developed a network of informers in Kiev, and that they're very well informed about what is actually going on in Kiev. So it's likely that they are getting information that affects or concerns the various political conflicts in Kiev. But, and I have to say this, that doesn't make them a reliable source of information about what is taking place there. Over the last few weeks, ever since Seymour Hersh published a piece on his blog in which he spoke about how the Trump administration is trying to remove Zelensky from his position as president, there's been swirling speculation about intrigues taking place in Kiev. There's been all sorts of reports and comments about this. Zelensky's actions, firstly his major government reshuffle, then his attempts to take control of Nabu and Sopar. All of these have been explained as part of this plot, this American plot to remove Zelensky that Seymour Hersh was talking about. And, well, given that this is so, and given that there have been protests in Kiev following the actions that Zelensky took against Nabu and Sopar, and given that there's been much criticism of Zelensky in the media in the West, and given that the European Union is now stopping transfers of funds to Ukraine, at least for the time being. Anyway, given that all this is going on, I think it's hardly surprising that the Russians are publishing their own piece saying that they have information that there is a plot to remove Zelensky being put together by the Americans and the British. It seems to me exactly what you would expect the Russians to do, to stir up the pot in Kiev, to feed Zelensky's suspicions, and to deepen the paranoia in the regime, and perhaps also to sow doubts amongst the regime's supporters, amongst Zelensky's supporters, that his position is stable, and to cause people to ask, well, maybe that report by Seymour Hersh was true, maybe it is based on something, and that Zelensky really is going, and for that reason we should distance ourselves from him. As I've said already, a political crisis in Kiev, which results in Zelensky's fall, is going to destabilize the political situation in Kiev and in Ukraine as a whole. And for that reason, I can completely understand why the Russians might decide that the moment has come to facilitate it by putting forth stories like this. The other reason, though, which is in some ways a more cogent reason for doubting this story, is that the three actors that are supposed to have met with the British and the Americans, and who's supposed to have agreed with the British and the Americans that, yes, Zelensky should go, and that they will support and assist in that endeavour, provided they are allowed to keep their jobs. Yermak, Zelensky, and Budanov are all known to be bitterly hostile to each other. Yermak has been trying incessantly over the last year to have Budanov sacked, and it's widely believed that the two men detest each other. Zelensky apparently has had a difficult relationship with Budanov in the past, and it seems unlikely that the relationship between the two has been resolved. In fact, I can remember that in the early months of last year, there was a very, very strange incident in which a Ukrainian military official was killed handling a present which he thought was some kind of grenade that had been dismantled in some way, that had been turned into a cocktail holder or a spirit holder or something of that kind, but which turned out to be a live grenade. Anyway, there were lots of rumors that the murder of this person was in some way connected to an ongoing feud between Budanov and Zelensky. So, as I said, these are all people who are known not to like each other very much. And beyond that, is it really plausible that Yermak, especially, of all people, who is deeply associated with Zelensky, in fact, the Financial Times has said that the two men actually sleep, I understand, in adjoining rooms on occasions, and that Yermak is personally devoted to Zelensky, whom he mostly controls. Is it really plausible that Yermak would become part of a plot to remove Zelensky when he would know that if Zelensky were to fall, he would be next in line to be purged as well? As I said, this story makes absolutely no sense to me whatsoever. But having said that, Kiev is a place where political intrigues happen. Yesterday, Anatoly Shary, a renowned Ukrainian blogger, claimed that Zelensky is currently seeking to remove Yermak. So perhaps the two men have fallen out. Perhaps Zelensky has been rattled by this report by the SVR and no longer trusts Yermak. Who knows exactly what is going on? Now, I would discount this story completely were it not for something else which has happened, which is truly remarkable. And that is that Zelensky, General Zulusni, Ukraine's ambassador to London, has given an extraordinary interview to Ukraine Vogue, including an interview in which we have a photograph of Zelensky posing in a most unusual way for an ambassador and a military officer. It's more like what you'd expect of a model, actually, and in which Zelensky talks about his philosophies, the sort of person he is, his deep beliefs in things, the way wars should be fought and how they can be won, and things of that kind. Now, I have to say, to me, that interview absolutely did look like a pitch by Zelensky for the political leadership of Ukraine. It looked to me as if he was putting himself forward for that role. And, well, that is the only actual evidence I've seen over the last couple of weeks that makes me wonder whether perhaps Seymour Hersh's claim might be true after all. As I said, this story from the SVR, I discount. The Shary story about dissension between Zelensky and Yermak seems to me unreliable and uncorroborated. But there is no doubt at all that Zelensky has given this extraordinary interview and has posed in this strange way. And that does make me generally wonder whether, in fact, he isn't, in fact, pitching to become the next Ukrainian leader. And if so, he can only have been encouraged to do that by some people in the British and presumably the American governments. Now, here I'm going to repeat the point I've just made. If the plotters really are plotting to bring down Zelensky, then they need to be careful what they wish for. In my opinion, removing Zelensky, who was, after all, elected president of Ukraine in 2019, and whose constitutional position as president of Ukraine, none of these people has challenged, and who has been Ukraine's wartime leader ever since the start of the special military operation in February 2022. Anyway, I can't help believe that Zelensky's removal is going to create a massive shock and is going to engender huge instability in Ukraine and in Kiev. The Ukrainian political elite, the military, and of course the wider population will know that it is possible to engineer the removal of a leader. It is all but inconceivable that any leader who replaces Zelensky will retain whatever kind of legitimacy Zelensky himself still has. The one will not transfer to any leader who replaces him as a result of what would in effect be some kind of unconstitutional coup. The other thing to say is that if Zelensky, of course, chooses to hold on, if he refuses to go, if he digs in, what are the political mechanisms of removing him? This could be a very messy business, an extremely protracted political crisis. I'm not sure how it plays out, and it would again further destabilize potentially the country. Thirdly, I'm not sure that Zelensky any longer is a viable leader for Ukraine. Had Zelensky made his move in the early part of last year, in the weeks and months after the defeat of Ukraine's summer 2023 offensive, at a time when it was becoming increasingly clear that Zelensky was becoming increasingly irrational in some of his decisions, but when his political position, his constitutional position in Ukraine was coming into question because his term was approaching its end, then it seems to me that Zelensky would have been in a strong position. He had significant loyalty at that time within the army, and he could have demanded that Zelensky step down at the end of his term, in which case he would have been in a strong position to take over. However, Zelensky didn't move. He accepted the job of ambassador to London. He's become detached from politics in Ukraine. I understand that his reputation within the army has declined. I don't believe that he is any longer the strong, widely supported figure that he was last year. And for the record, I don't think this interview that he's just given is going to do him any good at all. I would have thought that the frontline soldiers who who read this interview and who perhaps see this photo of him will be absolutely furious about him. They will be enraged that their former commander appears to be playing political games and is giving interviews of this kind. That's my own guess. Anyway, we shall see what happens. It is indeed starting to look as if the situation in Kiev is beginning to become more complicated. Zelensky's position, even if, as I personally still feel Zelensky's, I still feel, even if his position is still secure, nonetheless, criticism of him and challenges of him are growing, and this is taking place against a backdrop of reductions in American weapons supplies, uncertainties about money transfers from the EU, criticism of Zelensky, expanding criticism of Zelensky in the media, and of course, growing defeats on the battlefields. So it's possible that his position is indeed beginning to become less stable and less secure than I believed it was just a few weeks ago. But to repeat again, if he is overthrown, it will not stabilize the situation in Ukraine. It will not cause the Russians to change their approach to the war. The Russians will simply say, well, why should we? We set out our terms. We set them out in Putin's speech, the speech he gave on the 14th of June of last year. Zelensky has rejected those terms. If we now have a new president, General Zulusni, why would we want to change or alter those terms? Why would we not stick to the position we have consistently held to since June 2024? And would Zelensky, catapulted to power through what would in effect be a coup, with his position insecure and unstable and lacking legitimacy, would he be able to agree to these Russian demands? Agree to demands which Zelensky has rejected, and by the way, which the West has also rejected? I hardly think so. So it seems to me that replacing Zelensky with Zelensky at this time solves no problems. It only worsens the problems that already exist by introducing an element of instability, political instability, which for the moment, or at least up to a short time ago, as a result of the consolidation or apparent consolidation of Zelensky's position, didn't appear to be there. In fact, I'm going to go further still. I'm going to suggest that if we do see a coup in Kiev, because that's what it would amount to, and Zelensky is either ousted or forced to step down, because I cannot imagine Zelensky quitting easily or willingly, what that will do is accelerate the coming collapse. In fact, it could turn a process that probably still has months or perhaps even a year to run into a situation where the collapse might happen over the course of just a few weeks, with various military units increasingly skeptical about the whole point of the war, wondering what the purpose of fighting still is, given that there is no stable or legitimate government in Kiev anymore, with Zelensky himself having to take steps to distance himself from Zelensky and therefore turning back much of Zelensky's legacy, not just his legacy in terms of the conduct of the war, but also some of the domestic politics, the actions against the church, for example, which have pleased the nationalist wing in Ukrainian politics. And with Zelensky, uncertain of his own authority, uncertain of his own legitimacy, beholden to various political factions and power blocs, unable to make strong decisions, and unable indeed to make unpopular decisions, such as sometimes have to be made during a war, aware that if Zelensky was removed, somebody might remove him. As I said, to me, removing Zelensky at this time is not a recipe for stabilization. It is a recipe for collapse. Well, I've said all I want to say about this. I'm not somebody who takes a vast interest in political intrigues. I know some people revel in that sort of thing. I'm still skeptical, as I said, about whether it will actually happen. My own view is that the various stakeholders in Project Ukraine, the British, the Americans, the Europeans, most of the oligarchs, Rinat Akhmetov, the nationalist brigades, for the moment, it suits their collective interests to keep Zelensky in post, disastrous and often irrational and deeply corrupt as his leadership has proved to be. I don't think they have any interest in removing him, and for that reason, I expect him to stay. But if I am wrong, then, as I said, I'm confident of my further prediction that far from, as I said, bringing about any sort of stabilization, after possibly a brief moment of euphoria, what you will soon see is an accelerating collapse. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about this topic on this program. There's an awful lot more that could be said, no doubt, about it, but I'm not going to waste further time on it. That, what I have expressed, is my view. Now let's turn to the military situation. And the first thing to say is that yesterday, again, the Russian missiles and drones were buzzing and rocketing across Ukraine, continuing to mete out massive damage in various places and causing increasing havoc in Ukraine's rear. Getting a full and accurate assessment of what is going on, of the damage that this air offensive is causing, is very difficult to assess. But anyway, for what it's worth, the Russian offensive in the sky continues, and it continues to grow stronger. And as I said in my program yesterday, probably in the autumn, the Russians will be unleashing the jet-powered Geran drones in force, and we will see what those can do. Meanwhile, the ground war continues, and there's been a number of very interesting reports. The first comes from the courageous dissident Ukrainian MP, Mariana Bezuglaya, who, by the way, has just, as I understand it, admitted to suffering from Asperger's syndrome. Again, the fact that she's prepared to admit to this publicly, in my opinion, speaks well for her. It further shows that we're talking about a person of considerable moral courage. Anyway, she has confirmed that the Russian army is indeed fighting inside Pakovsk, and that the battles are actually taking place there, and that the situation obviously is becoming critical. She has again been very critical of the Ukrainian command. She always is that, and has criticized the lack of proper fortified positions and those sort of things. But the key point is that she has confirmed the rumors that there is fighting going on inside Pakovsk. Now, there have been some other reports, and they've come from the Russian side. Some of them have been reporting that the fighting in Pakovsk is continuing to intensify. They continue to report that there is a general shortage of Ukrainian troops defending in Pokrovsk, and that the Russians are pressing hard to capture the Dimitrov coal mine east of Mirnograd, and that the storming of Mirnograd is underway or is about to begin. But the most interesting report of all came last night from Radovka. These are Russian reports now, and I want to stress this. It reported this. It says that Russian troops have successfully launched an offensive on Belitskaya and Dobropilya. Belitskaya is the village, it's the big village north of Rodinska, on the main road leading into Pokrovsk from the north. So it says that the Russians are now aiming their offensive against Belitskaya and Dobropilya, which is a small town located to the west of this road. For the Russians to reach Dobropilya, they need to cross this road, which would mean, in effect, cutting the road. But then Radovka goes on to say that the offensive of the Russian armed forces at the junction of the Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka directions has led to important results, and that it can be considered the foundation for further assaults on Pokrovsk, Mirnograd, and Rodinska, with the surrounding villages that make up the large defensive area being steadily captured. And then it goes on to say that the Russian army has now captured Suvorovo, Nikanorovka, and Dorozhnoye. Now, Suvorovo and Nikanorovka were the two villages that I discussed yesterday, based on a report on the official Russian TASS news agency. The Russian Ministry of Defense had reported that the village of Boykovka, which is located to the southwest of Novotoretskoye, which the Russians captured about a couple of days ago, that the village of Boykovka had been captured. Suvorovo is shown by Radovka on a map to be located to the southwest of Boykovka. Nikanorovka, as I discussed yesterday, is to the northeast of Novotoretskoye. TASS yesterday was saying that the Ukrainian forces had retreated to these two villages, Nikanorovka and Suvorovo, because they were on higher ground. But Radovka is now saying that the Russians have already captured them. Now, again, to repeat, I have no confirmation of this, but Radovka is often ahead of other reporting channels in accurately reporting Russian advances. Not always, but often. So maybe Suvorovo and Nikanorovka have indeed been captured. And as for the village of Dorozhnoye, which Radovka is referring to, that is actually located to the west of Nikanorovka. If the Russians have indeed captured Dorozhnoye, then they are literally within a kilometer or so of Belitskaya, the village on this road leading from the north into Pokrovsk, and incidentally they would be very close to the road itself. They would be perhaps 1 or 2 kilometers distant from the road, so that the road would be well within range of anti-tank, some of their anti-tank missiles, for example, and definitely and obviously their drones. So this is what Redovka is claiming. Now, again, I don't want to rush ahead. Maybe this information from Redovka is ahead of what is being reported by other channels because it is ahead of the facts. But, as I said, Redovka in the past has had a record for reasonable reliability about these reports. It is moreover claiming that the Russians are now within 10 kilometers of Dobropolye, which is, as I said, this small town, to the west of the road that leads into Pokrovsk, and on which Rodinska and Belitskaya are located. Now, if all of this is true, and maybe it's not yet true, but probably if it is not true, then what Redovka is doing is giving us some insight into how events are going to develop. Anyway, if this is true, or if it becomes true soon, then obviously the road leading into Pokrovsk from the north is going to be cut. In fact, it looks to me as if that is indeed the Russian plan. The Ukrainians apparently rushed troops to Rodinska, seeking to hold Rodinska to prevent the road being cut. And Ukrainian channels and commentators are speaking with alarm and shock about how, instead of attacking Rodinska head on, the Russians instead advanced north of it to the main road. So it may be that this is what's happening and what is taking place. If it is correct, then of course any Ukrainian troops who are defending themselves in Rodinska are at risk of being themselves cut off. So anyway, this is what Redovka is telling us about the situation north of Pokrovsk. Now, Redovka is also saying something else. They're saying that the main reason for all of these very rapid Russian advances is because there is a general shortage of Ukrainian troops defending in this area. Again, I'll quote what they say. One of the main features of the new sector of military operations is that the Ukrainian troops are not even trying to stabilize the front. They're not launching any effective counterattacks, probably because large units of the Ukrainian armed forces are tied down by fighting along both the Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka directions. The Ukrainian command has too few forces at its disposal in the area of Belitskaya and Dobropolye, and maneuvering troops is extremely difficult for the enemy due to the fact that one wrong decision could lead to a collapse of the entire front and a catastrophe, which is especially true for the Pokrovsk direction. Thus, the Ukrainian armed forces in Dobropolye have very modest forces, are forced to act primarily according to the tactics of static defense of populated areas, trying in every way to slow down the advance of the Russians. And the Redovka actually goes on to say that one of the reasons why the Russians were able to break through into Pokrovsk from the south was that even as the Russians started to increase the pressure on Ukraine's southern outskirts, the Ukrainian military command, because of the general shortage of troops, was obliged to transfer the 210th Separate Assault Regiment of the Ukrainian army to defend Belitskaya. Well, all of this is very interesting, and we will see how things do indeed play out. But anyway, one gets a sense that things are indeed moving. Now, these Russian reports are corroborated not in terms of their detail, but in terms of what they're telling us generally by what the Ukrainians themselves are saying. I've read reports now that appear on Ukrainian channels that are being published by Ukrainian commentators, in which they too complain about the inadequacy of their defenses, about the poor level of training of some of the Ukrainian units, but above all, of the critical shortages of men and machines to hold the front lines. There is reports that speak of major gaps in the Ukrainian defense lines, so that small groups of Russians, usually numbering sections, little groups of 2 or 3 men at a time, are able to infiltrate a Ukrainian position, and then gradually, if they find that it is undefended, the Russian command will infiltrate more and more men into this Ukrainian position until a critical mass is created and the Russians are able to first consolidate and then conduct further advances. And the Ukrainian commentator who said this said that this is what happened in Selidovo, and that the Russians are applying the same lesson to Pokrovsk, and because they've learnt some lessons from Selidovo, which they are now applying, they're doing it even more effectively in Pokrovsk. Well, there we are. That is the state of the Battle of Pokrovsk, as far as I am able to assess it. It may be, as I said, that some of the information that's coming from Radovka is ahead of events. We shall see. But alternatively, it might be otherwise. If what Radovka is saying is true, then the situation for the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk is not bad. It is catastrophic. Now, I read another comment about the fighting in Pokrovsk, or in the area of Pokrovsk, from another Russian channel. I think its name was Military Chronicle. I can't remember its name. Anyway, it said that the Russians have now established such intense drone dominance over the roads to the north of Pokrovsk that it has become all but impossible for the Ukrainians to be able to send supplies to the Pokrovsk garrison, and that the garrison is in effect now encircled in the sense that it can't any longer receive supplies. Now, that doesn't mean that soldiers can't retreat, or that communications with the troops in Pokrovsk have completely broken down. Presumably couriers can still reach Pokrovsk if they have to, and I'm sure there's still radio communications and those sort of things. And maybe the Ukrainian soldiers in Pokrovsk, if they do decide to retreat, can retreat across the fields to the northwest of Pokrovsk in the area of Grishine, which is indeed apparently the major focus of Russian drone activity at the present time. But one can sense a darkening picture, and it seems to me that if there are political games going on in Kiev, almost certainly they reflect this. Now, there are other things taking place in other parts of the front lines. I read further reports, by the way, from some Ukrainian channels lamenting the fact that the Ukrainian command continues to send the best troops and brigades north to Sumy region, away from the main axis of the fighting in the area of Konstantinovka and Pokrovsk. If you want to get a good sense of the fighting from the Ukrainian point of view, then I would suggest go to a Substack blog called Events in Ukraine. The author, who is unknown to me, is clearly a critic of Zelensky, but he is very, very hard-working in assembling comments from various Ukrainian commanders and military bloggers and reporters, and you can get a good sense of the overall picture and the mood of the Ukrainian army from going to that blog. You can, of course, spend your time also ploughing through the various Telegram channels, but as I said, if you want to get a brief sense of what is happening, then, as I said, simply go to the blog, Events in Ukraine. Anyway, that's the situation as far as I can see on the front line, at least in the Pokrovsk area today. There is fighting, as I said, right across the front line. And by the way, before I forget, there were claims also from the Russians, from Russian blogs and Telegram channels and such places, that the Russian advances in the Siversk area have been underestimated, that there is only one hill, one elevation left north of Siversk, which is still under Ukrainian control, that the Russians in effect are literally outside Siversk now, and the implication was that an assault on Siversk, which is, by the way, a small place, I believe its population is around 10,000, comparable to Velikaya Novosilka, which the Russians captured some months ago. Anyway, it looks as if the Russians are now very close to launching their final assault on Siversk, if these reports are true. The loss of Siversk, by the way, would be an important psychological blow, as well as perhaps a tactical blow to the Ukrainians, because it has been a place where the Ukrainians have been consistently successful since the summer of 2022. I remember that there were brief claims, I believe they were made in June or July 2022, from various Russian sources, which I repeated, by the way, at the time. I had no way of not knowing that they were true, but there were reports that the Russians at that time had captured Siversk, which was completely wrong. And the Russians did, in fact, make several attempts to capture Siversk at various times over the period of the special military operation, but none of those up to now have been successful. Siversk in northern Donbass has played a similar role as a kind of fortress town, protecting various important lines of communication, which Ugledar used to play in southern Donbass. The Ukrainians lost Ugledar last autumn. If they lose Siversk, it will be a blow to them. Not just because, as I said, it is strategically an important place, which it is, but because it will be another one of these formerly seemingly impregnable places which the Russians will have captured. But anyway, we will see what happens there over the next couple of weeks. And in the meantime, even as all the fighting and the battles play out, we have further reports, this time from Reuters, that over the course of the discussions in Stockholm, the Chinese negotiators told Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, negotiations on extending the tariff truce between the United States and China Anyway, over the course of those negotiations in Stockholm, the Chinese told Scott Bessent and the American negotiators that China is not prepared to make any commitments to reduce in any way its imports of Russian oil. The Chinese apparently told the Americans that for China, this is an issue of sovereignty, of China's economic sovereignty, which as far as China is concerned is non-negotiable. They're not going to be told by the Americans from whom they can buy oil and from whom they cannot, and that if it means that the United States is going to impose tariffs on China because China buys Russian oil, then so be it. Now, that's what the Chinese said. Apparently, Scott Bessent told the Chinese that, well, in that case, following on from what President Trump has been saying, China should expect that there might indeed be tariffs imposed on China, presumably at some point in the next 10 or 12 or whatever it is days. Now, I'm going to make a number of observations here. President Trump has made verbal threats against Russia. He's threatened the Russians with sanctions. He's threatened countries that buy oil and gas and energy products with secondary tariffs. He's specifically threatened China and India. But I noticed that up to now, all of his threats have been verbal. He's not so far said anything about this or written anything about this on Truth Social, where he usually is very willing to set out his thoughts and views. And I wonder whether this is Donald Trump, for once, following the rule that all lawyers explain to their clients, which is that whatever it is that you may say, well, you can always deny, or you can always say that you were misunderstood or misrepresented, but what you actually write down, you are stuck with. And I can't help but think that Donald Trump's unwillingness up to now to write down the details of his threats against the Russians may be a sign that he's still uncertain in his mind about what exactly it is that he's going to do. He cannot by now be in any doubt that the Chinese are not going to shift. And he must know that if there is a renewal of the economic war of March and April between the United States and China, it is going to create problems for the United States. Since he made his comments in Scotland, in Keir Starmer's company, the price of oil has been rising. And obviously that isn't something that he will want to see. He has said, and this is a further sign of nervousness, that if Russian oil is withdrawn from the market, then the United States will cover the difference by increasing its production. Virtually every person I know who I take seriously, writing about issues in the oil industry, in places like oilprice.com, say that the United States has no means to increase production of oil. Oil in the United States is at peak production levels. The United States can maintain production. It cannot grow it. Saudi Arabia and some of the Gulf states do, in theory, have some additional capacity to increase production. Whether they would do so is another matter, and Besides, they can't do enough, or so it seems to me, to fully replace Russian oil if it is removed from the market. So I think that for that reason, as well as his concerns about getting back into an economic conflict with China, President Trump must be very, very unwilling to go down the road of imposing the kind of tariffs and restrictions on the Russian oil exports that he has been talking about. Besides, he's also been discussing India, and he says that he's going to impose 25% tariffs on India. They will pay 25%. And he says that this is in question to whether, there's been a deal finally agreed with India. I know it is okay. We're going to see. India has been a good friend, but India has changed basically more tariffs than almost any other country. But now I'm in charge, and you can't just do that. And in fact, the Indian Express, one of the Indian newspapers, has written that the Indians have been very frustrated by the negotiations with the Americans. They found the Americans very intransigent, insisting on duty-free access to the Indian market, which would be a huge reversal of policy for India. India has demanded that tariffs on India from the United States should not exceed 15%. But here we see that Trump is now talking about 25% tariffs on India, which the Indians are not going to be happy about. And anyway, the Indians are saying that there's been no sign of any breakthrough in the negotiations and that the negotiations are in limbo. The point is that Trump, however, is still calling India a friend, a good friend. He says the tariffs are going to be at 25%. There's talk about some kind of agreement being ironed out between the Chinese and the Americans in Stockholm over the next couple of days to permit trade between China and the United States to continue at the current levels of tariffs, which were agreed, I believe, in May. Is Donald Trump really going to cause all the enormous disruptions that he's threatening by going back on the tariffs he's going to impose on India, the 25% tariffs, and by tearing up any agreement that he's now reaching with China, because these two countries are buying Russian oil? He must know also, as I've said in many programs now, that if the Chinese call his bluff and he fails to impose the draconian tariffs on China, which he is threatening, he will enrage India and Indian opinion if he imposes higher tariffs on India than he is currently doing on China, or at least if he appears to be punishing India, which he calls a good friend, when he is not punishing China. So again, ultimately, when one takes stock, none of this in the end makes a great deal of sense. The Russians, by the way, have been saying more about this, and perhaps the most accurate reflection of their mood are certain comments that were made by a Russian MP, a member of the Duma, Leonid Ivlev, who happens to be a retired Major General of the Russian Armed Forces. And he put it like this: Washington is concurrently negotiating a range of deals with the European Union, Middle East, Indochina, Iran, Russia, but nothing is bringing about a positive result. It's like a deal for the sale of the rings of Saturn. All of this impacts Trump's policy and manifests his chaotic moves, such as loud statements, ultimatums, and sanctions, which give away his resentment that no one has called from the Kremlin after his previous ultimatum. I said this in my last but one video, that when somebody shortens a deadline in negotiations that I have myself been a party to, that is always seen as a sign of weakness and a sign of frustration by the side that's shortening the deadline, that its warnings are not being heeded. And I said that this is probably how the Russians would see it. And here we see Leonid Ivlev, the Russian MP and retired Major General, saying exactly the same thing. And then Ivlev continues, such cowboy tactics only prove that the United States still has no concrete peace plan for Ukraine, with pressure from defense companies and weapons supplies to Ukraine continuing. Washington's tariffs will set it at odds with the entire world, including China and India. Let us wait and see whether Trump is going to do this in 10 days. So that, I think, reflects the current Russian mood. Now, here I'm going to turn again to the agreement that Ursula von der Leyen and Donald Trump came to in Scotland, whereby the United States agreed to limit its tariffs on Europe to just 15%, which many European businesses and economies think would be crippling, or at least very difficult for them, whereby the Europeans, for their part, agreed to zero tariffs on American exports to Europe, and where the Europeans agreed to spend $750 billion over 3 years, $250 billion each year, buying American oil and liquefied natural gas, and also agreed to invest a further $600 billion in the US economy. Now, there has been a huge flood of commentaries about how these two figures, the $750 billion over 3 years that the Europeans are supposed to spend buying American oil and gas, and the $600 billion that the Europeans are supposed to invest in the American economy, how these figures are absolute nonsense. It's been pointed out that the total amount that the Europeans spend at the moment buying oil and gas from the United States in any 1 year fluctuates within a range of between $30 and $60 billion. It doesn't come anywhere close to the $250 billion that this agreement appears per year, that this agreement appears to envisage. For the European Union to spend that sort of sum, $250 billion a year, buying energy from the United States, it would mean that they would need to source 85% of their energy needs from the United States. And that would be extremely difficult to do. The problems with LNG terminals and other things are insurmountable. And besides, it makes absolutely no sense. It also makes no sense to invest $600 billion in the US economy. Nobody again explains how that's supposed to be done, or who is supposed to do it. And so many people are saying that this means that the whole agreement is a nonsense, that it's all smoke and mirrors, that it doesn't mean anything. Well, there's a number of things to say here. Firstly, obviously, these figures, the $750 billion to buy energy from the United States, oil and gas from the United States, and apparently weapons as well. The last is an item that has been overlooked, though it too would not make up the numbers. Anyway, that obviously is a figure plucked by someone, presumably Donald Trump, out of the air. And the same is true about the $600 billion that the Europeans are supposed to invest in the United States. I don't say that Trump himself doesn't believe in the reality of these numbers, but numbers has never been Donald Trump's strong point, and I think that he just, as I said, came up with them, and Ursula von der Leyen weakly agreed to them. Neither of them sat down and worked this out and worked out exactly what the figures, what the affordable and realistic figures should be. Now, this has led some people, and there's a really rather good blog about this, a good article, interesting article on a blog by someone called Warwick Powell. Anyway, this person, Warwick Powell, has written a rather interesting article which has achieved a lot of attention, in which he says that the whole thing is absolute bluff, it's complete nonsense. What it really is a trap whereby the Europeans make some completely fantastic offers to Donald Trump in order to persuade Trump to remain committed to the defense of Europe. And that the agreement should therefore be seen as a win for the Europeans and ultimately as a defeat for Donald Trump. Well, I think there is something to this argument. I definitely think that Ursula von der Leyen and Friedrich Merz and people like this, for them, and indeed Keir Starmer, for them preserving the American connection is the overriding priority that surpasses all others, and they are prepared to do almost anything in order to achieve it, even if it means sacrificing European industry and European living standards in the process. But that doesn't, I think, in the end, explain or justify this agreement. The first thing is that the 15% tariffs are real, even if all of the other figures, the $750 billion over 3 years and the $600 billion, are not. These are, as I said, real numbers. Ultimately, beggaring your economy, demolishing your economy in this way, in order to keep an American connection, which is looking more unstable by the month, doesn't seem to me to be any kind of clever plan or wise deal at all. In a program that Glenn Deason and I did with him, which you can find on the Duran, Professor John Mearsheimer, who I think has the best understanding of these matters than anyone else I know, said that with every step the Trump administration is taking, it is gradually ending America's long-standing involvement in Europe. And he thinks, and I agree with him, that even once Trump is gone, this is not going to change. The Americans are gradually leaving Europe. Moreover, the Europeans seem to know that the Americans are gradually leaving Europe. The latest British defence review actually said as much, that the United States is no longer the reliable ally that it once was. So if that is correct, and that is the widespread assumption and view across Europe, which I believe it is, then how does it make any sense to make these extraordinary concessions to the Americans, to agree that they should impose 15% tariffs on European goods, in order to cling on to the Americans when you know that in fact they're leaving? I mean, it makes to me no sense whatsoever. And I would add that the Europeans did have options. They could have slapped tariffs on America, or slapped or threatened to slap retaliatory tariffs on American services. They could have severely tariffed American exports of films, for example, movie films, cinema films to Europe, a major blow to Hollywood and to the American industry there. They could have done all kinds of things which would have put them in a much stronger position. They could have done the numbers. They could have worked out what exactly Europe could actually afford to pay in terms of buying gas and oil and those sort of things in the United States, and how much it could realistically afford to invest in Europe. It is not clever to just go along with whatever figures Donald Trump has plucked out of the air in order to try to keep him involved in some way. It is a sign of utter incompetence and complete failure. And in fact, in the Financial Times, I read with interest recently an article which said that when the Americans came along and started to negotiate with the Europeans in the weeks leading up to this meeting between Ursula and Trump in Scotland, the Americans were baffled by the passive way in which the Europeans were acting. They never made significant or serious counter-proposals. They never made any real suggestions about how trade between the United States and Europe could be moved forward. They acted throughout like the rabbit caught in the headlines of the oncoming car. And that, I suggest, is what we saw in the meeting in Scotland between Ursula and Trump. And here I'm going to finish again by returning to the topic of Keir Starmer, because if Ursula's performance in Scotland with Trump was abject, the same must be said for Starmer's. Now, it's not clear to me what exactly it was that Starmer thought he would achieve by meeting with Trump in Scotland, but of course Trump was in Scotland, so obviously Starmer had to go. But he did meet with Trump. They did talk about Ukraine, but it doesn't seem as if anything that Starmer had to say about Ukraine made any difference. There then followed an astonishing news conference, even more humiliating, I'd say, for Starmer than the news conference with Trump. Her news conference with Trump was for Ursula, because Trump droned on. He talked constantly. He barely gave Starmer an opportunity to speak. He lectured Starmer on British economic policy, on British migration policy, on all sorts of things. And Starmer, and his wife, by the way, who was also there, who gave every impression of wanting desperately to be somewhere else, basically were left listening to it all. I'm just trying to imagine prime ministers of an earlier era: Tony Blair, Margaret Thatcher, Harold Wilson. Prime ministers, some of whom to say it frankly, I have not liked. But I cannot imagine any one of them allowing themselves to be treated like a doormat in that kind of way. What we saw in Scotland was certainly another example of Trump's unusual personality. But we also saw in Scotland the abject, appalling quality of Europe's leadership at this time. European leaders told what to do, unable to think on their feet, unwilling to push back against the American president, laughing at his jokes, even when they're not even funny, agreeing with him, even when you know they don't agree with him, selling the shop to him, or not selling the shop, giving away the whole shop to him. I've said it before, I'm going to say it again. I cannot remember a moment in history when Europe, which of course includes my own country for this purpose, Britain, has fallen so low. Anyway, this is where I finish my program today. Let me remind you, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, X. Also, please remember, if you like this, please remember also to check out our shop. You can also go to Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.